everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I just want to, first of all, respond to some of your comments, as I said I would. Particularly one of you that replied several weeks ago, and I was rather slow in acknowledging your comments. Apologies for that, but I said I would reply on the channel. So this was in reference to the fact that autism is becoming increasingly unwieldy as a diagnostic category, and arguably no longer really makes much sense because of such disparate conditions being all lumped together under the same banner. It doesn't really make much sense anymore. And you replied by saying that diagnostic categories are constructs built around a cluster of behaviours, and that this is problematic due to the fact that two behaviours which are identical on the surface may have very different underlying causes, and that the current diagnostic and statistical manual criteria run contrary to the scientific ideal, which is to promote clarity. So I'm just paraphrasing, I'm not reading out the entire comment, but these are the key remarks you made. And now, the question, what is autism, can be answered differently based on someone's personal knowledge, experience, and even political views. So this sort of creates this kind of sea of chaos in the diagnosis, which doesn't aid clarity, because so many different conditions are being called the same thing that might actually have very little resemblance to one another, might even share different causes, and yet are all being called autism. And if everything is autism, then nothing is. And with that in mind, you say that Asperger's should have stayed in the books, as it's obviously very clearly not the same thing as non-verbal autism. It's a distinct category. So yeah, I am inclined to agree with the thrust of what you're saying there. That's why we do need more scientific rigour. Autism covers so many different conditions now that it is becoming rather overstretched, you could say, stretched to breaking point, and I do feel that we do need to slice it up into more meaningful categories, which I do feel will help everyone. It doesn't make any sense to call the type of autism I have and the type of autism that the person who commented has. It doesn't make sense to call that autism the same condition as what affects someone who is non-verbal, and it just does not make sense to say that that's the same condition, or even that it has anything really in common, beyond possibly maybe some slight similarities in genetic relationships. I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but really it doesn't have much in common, and it doesn't make sense to put them on the same line. It doesn't even make sense to call Asperger's high functioning autism, because that implies that you're comparing it to something that's the same, when if it's a separate condition, that makes no more sense than saying that I don't know, I can't think of an example, so my mind's gone blank. It just doesn't make sense to compare it, because they're completely separate conditions, basically, and it just doesn't help anyone. It trivialises the experiences of someone like me if someone says I have high functioning autism, because I'm like thinking I'm not on the same line as someone who can't speak, so why are you kind of suggesting I'm on the same level as them or comparing me to them? It kind of feels trivialising. It makes me feel like my problems don't matter, because I'm not here at the end of the day to constantly try and I'm not here as a comparison point. And I don't think it's fair on anyone to constantly have their condition compared to those of others. And yet we're sort of forced to do so because it's treated as the same thing. So it doesn't help anyone. And of course those who look after those people with non-verbal and associated intellectual disabilities, and who also have autism, it doesn't help them either, when autism is, because it doesn't help them. It doesn't help anyone if the same label is used when the conditions are so separate. And of of course, when people who are very, 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 very able and yet still are saying they have the same condition as me, go on about it just being a difference and not a disability, that is really irresponsible of them, because they should realise that as long as they should realise that by doing that, they're creating a lot of problems for people like me. But if they were given a separate name, a separate diagnosis, then that wouldn't be such a problem, because they could go and do that to their heart's content, and no one would be under any illusions that they're talking about people like me as well. Of course, they're not talking about people like me, but because they're using the same name, autism, some people might be confused to think that they are, and they're not. So yeah, it's just really, really confusing, and we just need clear subgroups, I think. The question is what those subgroups should be, and science is still in the dark ages on that. Another comment now, actually from the same person. Now this was in connection to cognitive testing and IQ tests. You say my cognitive profile is also very odd. So in your case, you have an extremely high verbal intelligence. You share that with me. Your verbal intelligence is was measured at 147, whereas I think mine, at the highest, mine was 142. At the lowest, because they do it in a range, don't they? So 142 is the highest, my highest verbal test. Sorry, 142 was the highest I got, or the highest that I'm capable of. And I think the lowest was something like, I can't remember now, was it 133, or was it 100 of, I can't remember, it might have been 100, I can't remember. It was in a range anyway, because I always put it in a range, but at the highest it was 142, so not far off from you. And your non-verbal was 108, so obviously a lot lower than your verbal. My non-verbal was a lot lower than that. My non-verbal, when I was a child, incidentally, my verbal was around 99 to 111. But yeah, my non-verbal has always been below 70, so obviously significantly lower than your one. But we both have that split. It's just that in your case, your non-verbal is higher than mine, but you still have a huge split between verbal and non-verbal, which is quite interesting. And also, of course, that's very common in Asperger's, actually, to have a split like that. That seems to be the Asperger's profile, actually, which is interesting. So like me, you have that profile. It's just that in your case, the non-verbal is a lot higher. Also, interestingly, in your case, you have a very high working memory and a high processing speed, both in the 99 percentile. So that's different to me. In my case, my processing speed is in the extremely intellectually disabled range, as tested, and my working memory is borderline impaired. But I think the working memory issue was borderline impaired mainly thanks to the numerical parts of the test, because obviously I do have a mathematical learning difficulty, so obviously that would impact that. I'm not sure in your case if you have any learning difficulties. I think having an additional learning difficulty can obviously make those scores a bit worse. So yeah, in your case you're highly gifted, but with a severe discrepancy between your verbal and non-verbal. I'd be interested to know, by the way, have you worked out what your global IQ score is? Because I'm guessing, obviously, based on that discrepancy, you wouldn't be given a global IQ score, as in it wouldn't make any sense. But it would still be interesting to know what the global IQ score would be. But yeah. So highly gifted, but with a severe discrepancy between verbal and non-verbal, and this explains many day-to-day challenges with tasks like driving or organising. However, you do not think that clinical testing of processing speed can reveal many of the challenges that you face in social contexts. Even someone who scores very high in the processing speed index in a clinical setting, as you do, can face serious challenges. In a clinical setting, there is no pressure except time, whereas in real life there's sensory issues, the setting itself, the number of people involved, and all of that can affect the ability to respond in due time. And that you have been reading on so-called cold versus hot executive functions. That's interesting because I haven't come across that before, so I might do some more reading on that myself. And you suspect that this slowing down of processing in real-life social settings may have something to do with this, particularly when sensory issues, emotions, and the ability to read context are at stake. So it's not just only about processing speed, but about how processing speed can be impaired by external factors as well. So your brain is unable to respond in quickly changing social contexts, and a lot better in one-on-one. So yeah, that's interesting. So as I say, as I've already said, I had I've got very slow processing speed as measured, but it sounds like, although your processing speed as measured is high, unlike mine, that we both have similar challenges in real world day-to-day settings. So yeah, it'd be interesting if they do more research on this, why some autistics, even though they get a good score on processing speed, say in a clinical setting, still obviously struggle in everyday life. And my guess is that the reason I got a depressed processing speed in a clinical setting, again, is probably due to the fact I also have coexisting learning difficulties, which can in and of itself impact those skills, even in a clinical setting. And I'm not sure about you, but you say you're highly gifted, so that might mean that in a clinical setting, you're better able to maybe compensate for those challenges, but you're less able to do that in a fast-paced setting. Maybe in a sort of more fast-paced real-world setting, your giftedness is not able to compensate in the same way. That's my guess. But because you are gifted, because your non-verbal is obviously a lot higher than mine, and you are gifted, maybe that just enables you to compensate in that environment. Whereas my really low non-verbal might mean that I don't have that ability to compensate, or something like that, I don't know. But yeah, it just goes to show how we're both impacted in real world settings, even though the scores we got in a clinical setting are rather different. Although we both have that discrepancy between verbal and non-verbal. And I agree with the points you make. It's obviously far more complicated than just a test, because I know some other people with Asperger's, another person with Asperger's who got a highly gifted score on her IQ testing as a child, and I don't think she had any discrepancy in scores, although she's very clearly and obviously Asperger's. So obviously, it's not, clinical testing in and of itself doesn't always reflect what is going on in a real world setting. It can only ever be an indicator, really. I'm also better one-on-one, by the way. We share that. So, just trying to find... And another one of you also replied on cognitive testing and said that your cognitive profile is also very odd. Sorry, I answered that one already. Where was the other one? Sorry, it's another one. I think we're mixed up. Another one of you said that my scores for verbal intelligence and non-verbal are both high. That's interesting. But your scores for processing and working memory is very low. So that's another... So this goes to show how we can all share the same diagnosis and yet have the exact things that come up on a cognitive test can be somewhat different. So in this case, it seems like the opposite in some ways. So for verbal intelligence and non-verbal are both very high, so my guess is not much of a discrepancy there. But your scores for processing and working memory are very, very low. So different to the other commentator, different to me in a sense that my verbal is very high but my non-verbal is extremely low, but similar to me and different to the commentator in that your processing and working memory are very low. So this just goes to show how you can see some similarities here, but you can also see some differences. I think the main similarities are that we all have rather strange results. Like they don't completely line up, whereas a non-autistic person you'd expect to find all their scores to be clustered around a similar point. So it's that spiky profile, it's just reflected in different ways because of our unique idiosyncrasies. But yeah, you feel this has had an effect on your ability to relate to and communicate with other people. Okay. So those are the comments for now. So I'm just going to move over to video number 2 just for a very quick little talk. So moving over to video number 2 now.